Hi there, as I said, my name is Lindsay Haswell. I'm from BAT in the UK, and I'd like to share with you some data on one of our recent clinical studies looking at the biomarker of exposure and potential harm in exclusive electronic cigarette users, current smokers, former and never smokers. This is a cross-sectional study, so we had 4 separate populations in this study. We had Vuse users, or electronic cigarette users. We had smokers, former smokers, and never smokers. Our primary endpoints here were 6 biomarkers of potential harm and 1 biomarker of exposure. The biomarkers of potential harm have been selected for their association with obviously cigarette smoking diseases such as lung cancer, cardiovascular disease, COPD, and the underlying disease processes of oxidative stress and inflammation. We had a number of secondary endpoints as well. That was 7 biomarkers of exposure and 1 biomarker of potential harm. The biomarkers of exposure were selected from the top Reg 9 list. And in this study, our primary objective was to compare the levels of Vuse users or electronic cigarette users with those of smokers. As I said, this was a cross-sectional study. It occurred in the UK at 1 single site in London. We had 4 separate populations. We recruited successfully 213 participants into the clinic. They came into the clinic for a relatively short period of time, only a couple of days, to allow us to collect 24-hour urine, blood, breath, and other measurements for biomarker analysis. And we used the CVAL compliance biomarker here in the Vuse user and former smoker populations to ensure abstinence from cigarette smoke. This here is the demographics for our CVAL compliant population. And as you can see, we had a nice balance between the sexes here, and also for age and also BMI, which I didn't show, we had a similar spread across each of the 4 populations. So now just taking you through the results of the CVAL compliant population, starting with the biomarkers of exposure. And here we have our primary biomarker of exposure, NNEL. And as you can see, when you look at the levels of the mean in the Vuse users and the former smokers, you can see there was a statistically significant difference between the 2 populations. And for the Vuse users as well, with their lower levels were also similar to former and never smokers. I'm looking at the secondary biomarkers of exposure. Here we've got biomarkers for acrotonaldehyde, acrolein, and 1,3-butadiene, and it's a very similar story. We see significantly lower levels at mean in the Vuse using population compared to smokers, and the levels in the Vuse users are similar to former smokers and never smokers. Here we have biomarkers for BAP and benzene. And it's hard to tell here on the left for BAP, but we also had significantly lower levels in the Vuse users compared to the smokers. What we did have here was one extreme outlier in the never smoking population. We think this is probably an environmental factor, possibly due to consumption of barbecued or smoked food, although we did ask the participants to refrain from eating or even being in the presence of cooking that type of food for 48 hours before attending the clinic. And as you can see here for the biomarker benzene, SPMA, it's a similar story. We have reduced mean levels in the Vuse user groups, similar to former smokers and never smokers. Again, here with a similar story with NAL, we got a significantly reduced level in the Vuse users compared to smokers, similar to former and never smokers. Slightly different, obviously, for nicotine. We have a slight reduction here, significantly significant between smokers and electronic cigarettes or Vuse users. But obviously, it is increased compared to former and never smokers because we wouldn't expect them to have any significant nicotine exposure. And this is just a quick summary here to just say that all the biomarkers that we looked at in our study for exposure were significantly lower in Vuse users compared to smokers. Now I'll take you through the biomarkers of potential harm. Just a quick refresh of the biomarkers we used, their association and their relevance to disease. Here we have the results for exhaled nitric oxide, which is a biomarker of lung health, and APPG, which is a biomarker for oxidative stress. And we did actually see some differences between the Vuse users and the smokers here, and there were favourable changes and reduced levels in the APPG. However, they did not reach the level required for statistical significance. Here we have two markers, one for cardiovascular disease, carboxyhemoglobin, and white blood cell count for inflammation. And in the carboxyhemoglobin results, we can actually see a statistically significant difference between the Vuse users and the smokers. For white blood cells, we did see a decrease, but unfortunately it did not meet the threshold for statistical significance. Here we have two biomarkers associated with cardiovascular disease. We have HDL and soluble ICAM1, and we did see favourable changes in HDL, but again, they did not meet the threshold for statistical significance, but we did see a reduction in soluble ICAM1, and that was statistically different between the Vuse users and the smoking groups. Here we have 11-DTX, which is a biomarker for platelet aggregation. It's been associated with development of cardiovascular disease. And again, we did see a difference between Vuse users and smokers, and the changes here were statistically significant. Again, this is a little summary. So we looked at 7 biomarkers of potential harm in our study, and we saw changes in 3 out of the 7, and those 3 being carboxyhemoglobin, soluble ICAM, and 11-DTX. So our conclusions for this study were that we were able to look at a combination of 17 different biomarkers in this study. Our biomarkers of potential harm changed for 3 out of the 7 to meet the threshold required for statistically significant changes, although we did see favourable changes in the other 4 that we did look at. And for all the biomarkers of potential harm in our study, we did see statistically significant lower levels in the electronic cigarettes of Vuse users compared to smoking. We believe that this data shows that there is evidence for the reduction of biomarkers of exposure and potential harm in electronic cigarette users in the real world, showing the positive impact of vaping compared to continuing to smoke. Thank you.